What is restorative justice? Well, this question can take on many different forms. On the one hand, restorative justice is a system that works to create sentences by focusing on the harm created and works to repair that damage. On the other hand, it is a set of principles that guides and invites discussions to close the gap between victims and offenders. Restorative justice has three main elements, which we will explore through three different films. Join me as I dive deeper to answer the question, what exactly is restorative justice? Sorry I Shot You is a 2018 UK short film based on the life of Dean Stanbury, otherwise known as Stana. The film reconnects with Dean after he shot a police officer during an encounter with a rival gang. 12 years later, he seeks to apologize to the man whose life he affected. This brings us to our first element of restorative justice: apologies. For apologies to be effective, they must include three specific aspects. These characteristics are guilt, vulnerability, and empathy. Let's explore these aspects as we go deeper into the film itself. Sorry I Shot You starts with a powerful quote by Stanbury, where he says,
children and that, so I've got to kind of, be the man and realise what I've done here. I've got children of my own, it's not, I know it's us against the police, I know how it goes, but at the end of the day, I'm a human being, he's a human being.
Through this quote, Stanbury has taken the first step in the process of restorative justice. To put it another way, he dared to acknowledge his wrongdoings by placing the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Through this acknowledgement, he took on guilt, which we can recall as the first characteristic of apologies. With this in mind, Dean seeks the aid of Only Connect. This criminal justice charity works to bring closure to victims and offenders through restorative justice principles. Within the initial meeting with Daniel Palmer and Carol Beckford, restorative justice practitioners, the two shed light upon the criminal justice system's limits and the story of Dean's past. One limit is that the victim and offender never get a chance to speak to each other.
So when you were in court, did you have much interaction with the police officer that you shot?
No, only when he came to give his account was the time that I saw him. That was it.
And do you know the extent of his injuries and the impact of the shooting on him?
Yeah, they said that he was going through stress. He was depressed. He had depression.
This limit never allows for the offender to realize the pain that they have caused and, as a result, may never take on the guilt for the harm caused by the crime. We also see another interesting factor of the crime from the perspective of the offender. Dean states that
I'd want him to know that it wasn't personal, and it was, I don't want to call it an accident because I was firing a gun, so it wasn't an accident, but it wasn't deliberate.
Through this account, we realize how some crimes result from social factors rather than the intention to create harm within society. The three then embark on a journey and create closure in Dean's life and the officer. This is yet another theme within the film, which is the empowerment to choose his own purpose. Restorative justice works to reduce crime by letting victims and offenders take responsibility. As a result, offenders learn from their actions and are less likely to reoffend. The second characteristic of apologies, which is vulnerability, occurs within Dean's conversation with his aunt and his uncle. They were aid companions that helped him through the deaths of both his mother and father.
Well, I got kicked out of a few schools when I was living with you, and obviously it was thrown into your path to be like the dad.
No, but I could not deal with Dean like a strict father figure than because I know that his pain, I can see it, I could feel his pain.
While reconvening on his past, Dean looks back on his father and how he strived for the best for his kids.
Looking back at it now, you get me, I can see that he was trying to be strong, you get what I'm saying? Like, and that's the mad thing.
In this scene, Dean saw how his crime harmed himself and the community. I believe that he may have seen his criminal behavior as failing his father's wish for his kids to become moral members of society. The only way he could have reflected on this idea is by allowing himself to become vulnerable to his thoughts and guilt. As a result, his vulnerability challenged him to pursue our last characteristic of apologies. Empathy is arguably the most critical part of apologies. It allows the offender to speak their mind and exhibit changed behavior. In the film's last act, Daniel, Carol, and Dean reconnect to discuss a letter from the officer.
He said he doesn't want to revisit that period of his life. He said he had quite a few regrets about what he did at the time, and he kind of wished he'd maybe reacted a different way to avoid being shot, essentially. He said it had a greater effect on his wife, and his wife died 2 years after the shooting. He said he wasn't happy with the sentence. He felt it should have been longer. He said at this stage he didn't want to engage in a restorative justice process. From what he'd seen in your rap career, he didn't feel that you'd been showing any remorse in your lyrics. If he saw there was any sort of change or evidence of that in your lyrics, then he would maybe consider wanting to speak to you or engaging with you, basically. He did actually wish you well, and he said, "I wish you every success in your rap career."
This discussion answers one of the many questions I initially had about restorative justice. What happens if a victim doesn't want to experience a restorative justice process? It is essential to know that either party does not have to have full participation in the restorative justice process. Instead, there must simply be an effort to accept healing and change. Lastly, Dean closes with a message to the officer where he takes responsibility for his past and looks to bring closure to their lives.
I made a huge mistake in 2006. I'm deeply sorry to you. I'm deeply sorry to your family. I'm deeply sorry for your loss. I pray that this documentary, this short film, do you know what I mean, kind of gives you some closure, and not that you forgive me or anything, but so you can just move on with your life.
While apologies are a good step into acknowledging an offender's actions, that doesn't change the fact that the crime still happened. The Prison Within leads us into the following main element of restorative justice: the reparation of harm. In other words, individuals involved in restorative justice must uncover the root causes of crime and unravel the resulting harm and its effects on the community. Such harm often stems from trauma that has impacted people's lives. The narrator of the film states why this sort of psychological suffering must be treated.
Trauma is the catalyst that begins a recurring cycle of crime and violence as we lock away what we don't want to confront.
The danger with incarceration is that it locks up offenders and forgets about them. To some, this is seen as segregating those who pose a risk to others from society. However, the harm this causes to both the offender and the victim often goes unnoticed. The Prison Within shows off what happens during victim-offender education groups, or VOG.
A key component of the restorative process is a timeline, where the men detail pivotal moments in their lives that caused them to change their outlooks and behaviors.
As the narrator suggests, people aren't born criminals. In essence, individuals change because of the harm they experience in their life. Sonia, an associate professor and survivor of childhood sexual abuse, sums it up perfectly by stating that
So Vogue sits at the nexus of restorative justice and trauma healing, and it's based on the philosophy that hurt people hurt people.
Another interesting quote about harm comes from Sujatha Balija. the director of this restorative justice project.
Our justice system currently operates in a way that centers people who have done harm, but not in any way that considers how to help them stop doing the harms that they've done or to understand where those harms come from.
What restorative justice does differently from traditional forms of punishment is that it actively considers the harm created by seeking to unravel the reasons behind it. People within prison confines are often told the same rules: mind your own business, don't talk to the staff, and don't get emotional. The Vogue program works to counteract these rules by providing a safe space for inmates to talk about their past. The only way this can be accomplished is through courage. To answer my own question of restorative justice, we must first uncover what questions the current and restorative justice systems have.
The current system of justice asks what law was broken, who broke it, and how do we punish them. And restorative justice asks a very different set of questions. It asks what happened and what needs to happen now.
Some of the root causes of crime mentioned in the film are intergenerational trauma, childhood trauma, and the pain that cages some offenders in. As Troy Williams put it,
I had locked myself in a prison before I ever went to prison. I built these walls up to shield me from this psychological trauma that was coming at me from every direction. And then we fall into the trap of the real physical prison for decades.
think about it. An individual who already feels isolated, alone, and is surrounded by pain is put into an institution that only magnifies these feelings.
People who are incarcerated are told you are your action and you're not worth anything. And what we do with Vogue, what we do with restorative justice is to separate the person from the action and say you are not your crime. You might have committed a terrible act, but that is not who you are in the core of your being.
This is another important factor in repairing the harm created. To quote Just Mercy author Brian Stevenson, each of us is worth more than the worst thing we've ever done. Considering this aspect, one factor about Vogues that piqued my interest is that other inmates help others interpret their own crime. Each of them is taking the personal responsibility to better themselves and others. This builds up a community that some of them may have lacked before coming into prison. Restorative justice does not just impact the offender. It can also provide healing and support for the victims of crime. Dionne Wilson, the wife of a fallen police officer, tells her story about how obtaining the death penalty for her husband's killer did not lift the weight off of her shoulders. In her own words, she says,
I just became really depressed, and that's how I stayed for the next couple of years. I was just stuck.
No matter your opinion on incarceration, we cannot deny that it does little to nothing to restore the harm created. It is only through understanding the root causes of crime and working hard to repair that harm that we can instill change in offenders and healing in victims. Lastly, listen to one of my favorite quotes from The Prison Within.
I took it upon myself to kill somebody, to hurt somebody. Now I owe it to society, I owe it to me to understand what I did, to own up to what I did. The programs that I learned here in Vogue, I sit with my kids them in the visiting room and I teach them it. That's my debt to society. And it hurts because it took coming to prison for us to wake up. It's not prison did it, but something clicked. It was that aha moment that woke us up and to realize what we did.
Statistically speaking, prisoners who are incarcerated are going to be released anyways. Why not use restorative principles to allow them to become individuals whom society and they themselves want to be? The first two aspects of restorative justice I mentioned are more concrete. What I mean by that is that both apologies and the reparation of harm are tangible. Apologies can be spoken, and and the reparation of harm is achieved through circles or open dialogue. This last aspect, I think, can be used to sum up restorative justice as a whole. It drives restorative practice to allow individuals to inflict change within their lives. The last element is hope. Circles follows the story of Eric Butler, a Hurricane Katrina survivor, a restorative justice coordinator, and a father. He outlines one reason why he engages with restorative work within schools.
Every interaction that a kid has in this community with violence has the potential to being deadly. So if we can interrupt that cycle, that's the reason why I'm constantly doing this work.
As evident in the film, restorative work does not just happen within prisons. However, the principles used can be applied to any scenario. This is what is referred to as living restoratively. Circles also address some concerns that people have about restorative justice.
When students go through restorative justice, I don't think sometimes they realize that their actions have consequences. But at some point, they got to stop taking advantage of us. And so, where does restorative justice draw the line?
As well as some important aspects about healing circles.
You trust me? Mm-hmm. You know I'm not gonna hurt you, right? Mm-hmm. You know I'm not gonna let nobody hurt you, right? Mm-hmm. You know that? Mm-hmm. All right. And that's all you need to know. You have the right to feel how you feel right now. But I don't want you to give up on yourself.
One key part of circles from that scene is that they include trust for them to work. Without it, offenders or students can't begin to work towards bettering themselves for the community. As seen here, Eric is leading a healing circle for Mercedes, a high school senior who is about to graduate. She also experienced family trauma and is at a rough point in her life. Lastly, change can only come from respect from both sides.
All right, so, and you have to respect the authority that's in the house, right? There's authority in the school, but that you have to also respect.
I'll be honest with you, this part of the script took me a lot longer to write, partially because this is restorative justice at its most real point. I didn't understand why Eric left Mercedes as soon as she had a plan to graduate. Why did he move on after he spent so much time building her back up? But maybe that's the point. Restorative justice doesn't have to follow everyone involved throughout their entire life, but instead gives them the opportunity to change and empower themselves to make their own decisions. That's why restorative justice needs hope. The hope that people will make that change and try to live restoratively. I came to realize that it's not about trying to give people a perfect life. It's about picking people back up at their worst so we can leave them to become the best that they can be. In the end, Mercedes graduated from high school and took up nursing at a local college. And the high school Eric was working in implemented restorative justice, which resulted in no suspensions, expulsions, or any violent student altercations. Graduation rates also rose from 68% to 92%. It's not about focusing on people's past failures. It's about giving people tools to build hope for the future. So what exactly is restorative justice? Well, it's a mixture of three main elements. First, Sorry I Shot You teaches us that apologies are the key starting point for change. Next, The Prison Within explains how by uncovering the root causes of harm and crime, we can instill change into the hearts and minds of victims and offenders. Lastly, Circles is a film about how hope can allow us to build up others so that we can leave them to become the person they want to be. In the end, restorative justice is a lot of things. It's a toolkit that allows us to restore harm. It's also a set of principles that invites discussion between victims, offenders, and the community. But most importantly, it's a way of living that allows us to see past people's mistakes and lets us see others simply as human beings.
I don't like what they say in this city no more. But I can't sit and die in this traffic no more. I'm packing up and